The wind carried dust across the wooden fences of the quiet frontier town, rattling loose shutters and whistling through the gaps in old barns. The late sun was sinking behind the far hills, throwing long shadows across the dirt street that split the village in two. For years, this place had known its share of hardships, raids, cattle rustlers, but the townsfolk had learned to endure. They worked the land, mended their homes, and tried not to look back at the scars that history had carved into their lives. Yet on this particular evening, a silence heavier than any before hung in the air, broken only by the distant thunder of hooves. Every man, woman, and child in the village turned toward the sound, their eyes narrowing against the golden light. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, and from it emerged a long line of riders. Horses moved in unison, warriors dressed in buckskin and feathers guiding them forward with a calm but commanding presence. At the front of the column rode a woman, with a spear upright in her hand, her gaze sharp as a blade, her bearing regal as if she had returned to claim something long denied. The air grew tense, for the townsfolk knew these were Apache warriors, and their arrival was no casual visit. By the fence on the edge of the street, a weathered cowboy leaned on the rough timber rail, his jaw tightening as he recognized the face leading the riders. His hat shaded his eyes, but his heart told him what his mind could hardly believe. It was Hertha, the girl he had once helped, forgotten by most, left to the mercy of fate 15 long years ago. She had been young then, barely more than a child, shivering and hungry, with the look of someone who had seen too much suffering. He had given her food, water, and protection when no one else would, thinking their paths would never cross again. Yet now here she was, no longer a helpless girl, but a leader returning with the weight of a people behind her, the town remembered. The stories whispered around campfires. The Apaches had been pushed from their lands, hunted, and scattered. Many thought they had vanished into the hills for good, broken and forgotten. But tonight, that belief crumbled before their very eyes. The riders advanced slowly, their presence a reminder of unfinished history. Mothers pulled their children, clothes shopkeepers closed their shutters, and men reached instinctively for the rifles hanging over door frames. Fear crept along the street, though no words were spoken. The cowboy did not move. His rough hands gripped the fence rail, his eyes fixed on her. He remembered the night he had found her by the river, weak and near collapse. He had hidden her from soldiers who would have taken her life without hesitation. He had carried her back to safety, tended her wounds, and given her a chance to live. To him it had been a moment of simple humanity, a choice he made without thinking of the consequences. To her, perhaps it had meant something far greater. Now, 15 years later, she carried herself with the strength of someone forged by struggle. The paint on her face told of tradition and war. The feathers in her hair marked her as more than a warrior. She was a leader. Eyes met his across the space between them, not with hatred nor with warmth, but with a look that pierced through time itself. It was as if she had returned not only to remind him of what he had done, but to show him how deeply that act had changed the course of her life. The townsfolk looked from her to the cowboy, sensing a thread between them, though none could guess its nature. Whispers spread in the uneasy crowd. Who was she? Why had she come? And what did it mean for the fragile peace of their settlement? The warriors behind her held their silence, waiting for her command. The dust settled around their horses' hooves. The only sound, the creak of leather and the faint jingle of reins. For the cowboy, memories flooded back. He recalled the fear in her eyes when he had found her, the desperation in her voice when she had begged for help. He remembered the way she had disappeared into the night after he had given her shelter, vanishing into the wilderness like a shadow. He had wondered at times if she had survived, but life had its demands, and he had put the memory aside as the years rolled on. Now confronted with her return, he understood that nothing in this land was ever truly forgotten. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken meaning. The girl he once knew was now a woman who commanded respect from every warrior behind her. She had not come alone, and she had not come without purpose. Whether her return meant vengeance, justice, or something else entirely, the cowboy could not yet tell. What he did know was that the choices of the past had come riding back to him, and the town he called home was about to be caught in the storm that followed. Still leaning on the fence, the cowboy took a slow breath. His eyes never left hers. Around him, the people shifted uneasily, waiting for the first word, the first movement, the first sign of what was to come. The evening light bathed the village in gold, but the air was cold with tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The woman raised her spear slightly, not as a threat, but as a signal. The horses stopped in perfect unison. The dust settled around them, leaving only silence. She looked at him with an expression that held 1,000 memories and 1,000 questions, as though the years between them had vanished in an instant. Then she spoke, not loud, not soft, but clear enough for him alone to hear. "You once gave me life," she said, her voice steady. "Now I have come to see what you will do with it." The cowboy's hand tightened on the rail. He could feel every eye in the town on him, every heartbeat waiting for his reply. He knew that whatever he said next, whatever choice he made, would decide the fate of more than just himself. And as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, shadows stretching long across the village, the story that had begun 15 years ago was about to continue in ways no one could yet imagine. The cowboy didn't answer right away. His throat felt dry, as though the desert wind itself had stolen his voice. The words she spoke rang in his ears, stirring up dust from memories long buried. He could see her clearly now, sitting tall on her horse, the light glinting off the iron tip of her spear. She wasn't the frail child he remembered, trembling and desperate by the river. She was someone else entirely, someone hardened by time, molded by loss, sharpened by survival. Still, despite the distance of years, he knew she was the same girl he had once chosen to protect when the world had turned its back on her. The townsfolk stayed frozen in silence, all eyes darting between the woman on horseback and the cowboy at the fence. No one spoke, but everyone understood that something unspoken bound these two together. Fear lingered in the air, but so did a strange sense of curiosity. People whispered to one another in low voices, too hushed to catch. As the tension grew heavier than the evening heat, the cowboy shifted his weight, his boots crunching on the dirt. "You've come far," he finally said, his voice even, though it carried a quiet edge. The Apache woman's gaze did not falter. "Farther than you think," she replied, her words carrying the weight of journeys no one here could imagine. "Your people forgot what they did to mine. But I never forgot the night you chose to see me as more than an enemy." Her voice was steady, yet beneath it lay something raw grief, perhaps, or determination forged in fire. The cowboy felt a pang in his chest, remembering how small and fragile she had looked when he found her. He had wrapped her in his coat, shared his bread, and carried her to safety, even as patrols searched the area. That night, he hadn't thought about tribe or blood or history. He had only thought of keeping a dying girl alive. But now, seeing her return as a leader, he realized that night had meant far more to her than it ever had to him. The horses shifted their weight, snorting in the cooling air. Dust swirled at their hooves and the town seemed to shrink back, waiting for something to break the standoff. Behind her, the Apache warriors sat like shadows carved from stone, their eyes unyielding, their hands resting close to their weapons. They did not need to speak. Their silence was louder than any war cry. The cowboy thought of the townsfolk behind him. Families who had scratched out a living here for years, men and women who had come west chasing hope or running from the past. They had built a community on this land, but the land had belonged to others long before fences went up. He knew that. Everyone knew that, though few spoke it aloud. The woman's presence now was a reminder of debts unpaid, of wounds left open. Still, she hadn't come charging with fire and fury. Not yet. She had come with words, and her words were aimed at him. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. Her expression hardened, though her eyes burned with something more than anger. "Because the time for silence has ended? 15 years I have carried the memory of your kindness, but kindness cannot erase what was taken from us. The land, the lives, the honor of my people. You gave me life, cowboy. Tonight, I come to see what life is worth in a place that has forgotten ours." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some shifted nervously, clutching their children's shoulders. Others reached for their rifles, their hands trembling. Fear, anger, confusion, all of it swelled together in the small town street. The sheriff stepped out of the general store, his badge glinting in the fading light, but even he held back. Sensing this was not his moment to intervene, the cowboy felt the weight of every stare pressing against his back. The woman had chosen him, and now the town wanted to know why. He didn't have the answer, not yet. He looked at her again, searching her face for something familiar. The girl he had saved had been soft-spoken, her voice barely above a whisper. This woman spoke with fire, her words cutting like steel. She carried herself with the pride of generations. He could not help but wonder what had happened in those years between what trials had shaped her into the leader who now stood before him. The silence grew heavier. The woman lowered her spear slightly, resting it across her saddle, though the gesture was not one of surrender. It was a sign of patience, of waiting. "I do not seek blood tonight," she said, her voice firm enough for all to hear. "But I seek truth, and I will not leave without it." Her words struck the cowboy like a hammer. Truth. That was something this land had avoided for far too long. He thought of the treaties broken, the skirmishes waged, the families lost on both sides. He thought of the land itself, once open and free, now carved with fences and borders. But he also thought of her, the girl he had carried too. Safety Ann wondered if her return meant hope or ruin. The crowd behind him began to stir, restless and uneasy. Questions flew in hushed tones. What does she want? Why is she looking at him? What's this about truth? Suspicion and fear clung to every word. The cowboy raised a hand slightly, signaling for quiet. He did not know what he would say next, but he knew he had to keep the moment from breaking. "Then let's talk," he said finally. His voice steady, though his heart raced. The woman studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deceit. After a long pause, she gave a single nod. "We will talk," she agreed. "But not in whispers, and not in shadows. Your people must hear, as mine have heard. The truth belongs to all." Her words sent another ripple through the crowd, this one sharper, cutting deeper. Some muttered in protest, others stood silent, their expressions unreadable. The cowboy felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the earth itself was bracing for what was to come. She turned her horse slightly, lifting her chin as her warriors stayed close behind. The fading light cast long shadows across the town, painting the street in gold and gray. The moment held, fragile and sharp as glass. As both sides waited for the next move, the cowboy knew this was only the beginning. Whatever truth she carried with her, they would change everything. The past was no longer something to bury beneath dust and silence. It was riding straight into their lives, demanding to be heard. And though he had no answers yet, he knew one thing for certain. The story that began 15 years ago was far from finished. It had only just begun to unfold, and the path ahead would test them all in ways they could not yet imagine. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and horse sweat, mingling with the smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote cried, its voice thin against the vast silence. The woman did not look away, and neither did he. Their eyes held across the space between them, bound by a memory neither could escape. The cowboy swallowed hard. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. And as the first stars pricked the evening sky, the forgotten girl turned leader, waited for him to take the next step. While the town itself stood on the edge of a story that would change it forever, the night settled over the town with an uneasy weight. Lanterns flickering to life along the porches and windows. Yet no one felt at ease. The Apache riders remained outside the main street, their silhouettes dark against the glow of firelight, waiting like shadows that refused to fade. The townsfolk lingered in doorways and behind curtains, whispering to one another, their voices trembling with questions that had no answers. The air carried the sharp scent of horses, wood smoke, and fear. The cowboy hadn't moved far from the fence. His hands rested on the worn timber, but his eyes followed the woman who had once been a half-starved girl in need of help. Now she commanded more power than anyone in this settlement could ignore. Her words still echoed in his head. The truth belongs to all. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt, his hand resting on the handle of his holstered gun, though he didn't draw it. He was a cautious man, older now, with a face carved by both sun and worry. "What's this about, Cowboy?" he asked in a low voice, his eyes flicking between the two of them. "Why is she speaking to you like you owe her something?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. He could feel the stares from every doorway, the questions pressing down on him. To admit the truth meant admitting he had once broken silence, crossed a line most men here wouldn't dare. He had saved a girl his people were taught to call an enemy. "She was lost," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I found her. I helped her. That's all." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "And now she comes back with an army at her back. You think that's just coincidence?" The cowboy looked out at the riders again. Their faces were hard, unreadable, yet there was no mistaking their discipline. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't reckless violence. This was something planned. The woman turned her horse toward the crowd, her posture unyielding. "For years your people have told only one story, the story of settlers, of land claimed, of towns built. But my people lived here long before your fences cut the earth. We've buried our dead beneath these hills. We hunted the buffalo on these plains. And when we resisted, you called us savages. You tried to erase us. Yet here we are." Her voice carried in the stillness, reaching every ear. Some townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, while others muttered curses under their breath. But no one dared interrupt her. The cowboy's chest tightened. He could see her strength, but he could also hear the pain behind her words. He thought of the children in town who had grown up never knowing this history. Only the version written in school books and told around campfires. He thought of his own choice years ago, to see her as a person, not as a threat. And now that choice bound him to her. Whether he wanted it or not. As the woman finished speaking, one of the townsmen, a burly rancher with a voice loud enough to carry, stepped forward. "We've done nothing to you," he barked. "This land is ours now. You want revenge for the past? You won't find it here." The Apache riders stirred, their horses shifting. But the woman raised her hand, and they stilled instantly. She fixed her eyes on the rancher. "Revenge? No, I did not come for revenge. I came for remembrance. And for justice." The word hung heavy in the air. Justice. A word that meant different things to different people. To the townsfolk, it sounded like accusation. To the warriors, it sounded like promise. The cowboy could feel the ground between the two sides cracking. If someone pushed too hard, the fragile line holding back violence would snap. He stepped forward, placing himself between the crowd and the riders. "She's asking to be heard," he said, his voice calm though his pulse raced. "If we silence her now, we'll only bring blood to our streets. Let her speak. Let's hear the truth she carries." Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some nodded reluctantly, others scowled. The sheriff gave him a hard look, but after a long pause, he gestured for the people to quiet down. The woman dismounted her horse, landing softly in the dirt. She stood tall, the feathers in her hair shifting gently in the evening breeze. The movement alone unsettled the crowd, for it showed she wasn't afraid to stand among them without her mount. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving the cowboy. "You showed me mercy when I had none," she said. "But mercy does not erase loss. My people still live in the shadows of what was taken. We still bury children who starve because the land we once roamed freely is now locked away behind your fences. I come here not to destroy, but to remind you that the story is not finished. You may have forgotten us, but we have not forgotten ourselves." The cowboy felt the words burn inside him. He wanted to respond, but the sheriff cut in. "What is it you want from us? Say it plain." She turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "We want a voice. We want the truth spoken aloud. And we want a choice in the land that once gave us life." The crowd erupted into angry shouts. Fear and resistance spilling into the air. The idea alone was enough to stir panic. Land was everything here. It was survival, legacy, identity. To even speak of giving any part of it back was to threaten the foundation of the town. But amidst the shouts, the cowboy saw the woman's eyes fixed on him again. as though she were asking not for the crowd's understanding, but for his. She had carried his act of kindness for 15 years. Now she asked him to carry her truth. That night, the Apache camped outside the town, their fires glowing on the outskirts like watchful stars. The townsfolk barred their doors, speaking in hushed tones, while the leaders gathered in the saloon to argue over what to do. Some demanded the sheriff run the warriors off at gunpoint. Others worried that such a move would bring retaliation. The cowboy sat in the corner, silent, listening, feeling the weight of every voice pressing down on him. He thought of her words, "We want a voice." He thought of the girl he had once carried in his arms, now standing tall with the strength of an entire people behind her. And he thought of the land itself, stretching wide under the stars, ancient and enduring, carrying the scars of every story written upon it. Meanwhile, outside town, the woman sat by the fire, her warriors surrounding her in silence. They did not question her decision to return here. They trusted her, believed in her vision. But she carried her own doubts in the quiet of the night. The cowboy's face haunted her, an image from her past, tied to her survival. He had once been a stranger who gave her life. Now he was the only one who could help her make her people's truth known. The night stretched long, heavy with tension. Neither side slept easily. The town dreamed of war, the warriors dreamed of justice, and between them both stood the memory of a single act of kindness that had changed everything. When dawn came, sun painted the hills in fire and gold. The Apache riders rose with the morning, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. The townsfolk watched from behind their fences, fear etched into their faces. The cowboy stood once more by the same rail, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. No blood had been spilled, not yet. But the question lingered, sharp as a blade. What price would be paid for the truth she demanded? And what role would he play when the time to choose finally came? The answer waited in the silence. As the land itself seemed to hold its breath, the morning broke with a sharp wind that carried the dust across the empty street. The town looked almost frozen, its people watching from behind windows, hands resting on curtains, rifles leaning close at their sides. No one wanted to be the first to step out. No one wanted to make the mistake that might bring the silence crashing down. Out beyond the last line of fences, the Apache camp was already awake, their fires burning low. Horses restless as they stamped the earth. The cowboy stood where he had stood the night before, leaning on the same stretch of fence, but he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him harder than ever. His eyes kept straying to the hill where the warriors had gathered, where she stood with them. Even from this distance, he could sense the calm authority in her presence. She wasn't here to beg. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to demand, and demand in a way that left no room for ignoring behind him. The sheriff's voice cut the morning air. "We can't let this go on much longer," he muttered, just loud enough for the cowboy to hear. "The people are restless. The ranchers say if we don't act, they'll take matters into their own hands. And you know what that means." The cowboy didn't turn. He knew exactly what that meant. Violence. Fear taking control. The kind of rash move that would start a fire too big to put out. He kept his voice low, steady. "If we push first, Sheriff, we won't be the ones deciding how this ends." The sheriff gave a sharp sigh, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew the truth of it. As the day wore on, the two sides began to circle each other without moving. The townsfolk carried out their chores with nervous glances toward the horizon, never straying too far from their rifles. The warriors stayed where they were, watching, waiting. The distance between them wasn't just in yards of dirt. It was in years of anger, in memories of loss, the deep scars of a history neither side had healed. In the saloon, voices rose again. Ranchers argued that the town should gather a force and drive the Apaches away before it was too late. Others warned that such a move would bring destruction down on them. The cowboy listened, silent, while their words collided like fists. Every argument came back to the same question. What did she want, and how much were they willing to give? That night he couldn't sleep. He walked the dirt road in silence, the moon throwing pale light across the buildings. His boots crunched against gravel as he found himself wandering toward the outskirts, toward the glow of the Apache fires. He stopped before he reached them, his hand resting on the wood of the fence, as if the barrier itself could keep him from crossing. Then he heard her voice. "You are restless, cowboy." She stepped out from the shadows, her form lit by the faint glow of fire behind her. She walked with the same steady grace she had shown all along, her eyes fixed on him. "You watch us," she said softly, "but you do not act." He met her gaze. "If I act, I risk making the wrong move. And the wrong move here costs more than just me." For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips, though it was edged with sadness. "You always thought too much." Even then, the words carried him back to that night 15 years ago, when he had found her by the river, weak and near death. He had acted then, not by thinking, but by instinct. He had carried her without knowing what the cost would be. That single act had tied them together across the years. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. She looked past him, toward the town, her face unreadable. "I want them to remember. I want them to hear the truth. I want them to know that we are not ghosts. We are flesh and blood, still here, still standing." He swallowed hard. "And if they refuse?" Her eyes darkened. "Then we will remind them another way." The unspoken meaning was clear. If words failed, the warriors behind her would not. The cowboy felt his chest tighten. He wanted to believe there was still a way to bridge the gap, to keep the land from soaking in more blood. But the longer this standoff lasted, the more brittle it became. One spark, one mistake, and everything would burn. When dawn came again, the town was already awake, tension running like a fever. The Apache riders mounted their horses and rode slowly toward the main street. The townsfolk lined up along the edges, guns clutched tight, faces pale but defiant. The sheriff stood in front of the general store, his jaw locked tight, his hand never straying far from his weapon. The cowboy was already there, standing in the center of the dirt road. He watched as she led her riders closer, dust rising around them, the sound of hooves like a drumbeat. When she stopped, her warriors fanned out behind her, silent and steady. She raised her hand, and the street grew so quiet it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. "We have waited long enough," she said, her voice ringing clear. "We will not be silent any longer." Her words cut through the morning air like a blade. The sheriff's hand twitched near his gun. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. The cowboy could feel the line trembling, the edge about to break. One of the ranchers stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "We won't give you an inch of land," he shouted. "Not 1 inch. You hear me? You bring your warriors here, and you think you can scare us? We built this town with our own hands. We bled for it. You come here now and demand justice? You'll find nothing but bullets waiting." The crowd stirred, voices rising, fear mixing with fury. Some shouted in agreement, others shouted to keep peace, but the noise swelled like thunder. The Apache riders shifted, hands brushing weapons, eyes burning. The woman didn't flinch. She sat tall in her saddle, her gaze steady, but her hand gripped her spear a little tighter, the wood creaking under her fingers. The cowboy stepped forward quickly, raising his voice over the chaos. "Stop!" he called out, his tone sharp enough to cut through the noise. The street went still again, but it was a fragile stillness, brittle as glass. He turned to face the crowd. "If you fire the first shot, it'll be your children who pay the price. You think you can drive them off? Look at them. They didn't come to beg. They didn't come to run. They came to be heard. If you silence them now, you'll bring war to every doorstep in this town." His words hung heavy in the air. Some of the townsfolk looked away, shame flickering across their faces. Others gripped their rifles tighter, unwilling to let go of their anger. The sheriff's jaw tightened, torn between duty to his people and the truth he couldn't deny. The woman's eyes softened. Just for a moment, as she looked at the cowboy, she knew he was the only one standing between peace and bloodshed. But even he could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet, as though the land itself was warning that time was running short. The rancher spat in the dirt. "Talk all you want," he growled. "But when it comes down to it, we won't bow." The woman's warriors shifted again, tension rippling through them. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, the cowboy felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the climax was near, that one breath, one word. One twitch of a hand could decide the fate of everyone here, and as the sun rose higher, throwing hard light across the street, both sides stood locked in silence. Waiting for the storm to break, the sun stood high above the town, glaring down on the silent standoff. Horses pawed at the dirt, restless under the weight of tension. The townsfolk clutched their rifles, their knuckles pale, while the Apache riders sat like statues, waiting for a signal that would decide everything. For a breathless moment, it seemed the air itself would split apart with gunfire. Then the cowboy stepped forward. His boots dragged dust into the still air as he moved to the center of the road, placing himself between the two sides. He raised his hands slowly, not as a plea, but as a shield. His voice was steady, though his chest pounded. This can't be how it ends. Not here. Not now. The words seemed to break the spell. The crowd shifted, uncertain, their anger cooling under the weight of his presence. The Apache woman's grip on her spear loosened, though her eyes stayed sharp and watchful. She studied him carefully, as though searching for proof that he truly meant what he said. The rancher who had shouted before spat in the dirt again, his face red. "You'd stand with them over your own?" The cowboy turned his head slowly, meeting the man's glare. "I'm standing with what's right. 15 years ago, I found a dying girl by the river. I gave her food, water, shelter, not because of what she was, but because she was human. I won't forget that, and neither should you," the townsfolk murmured, the story passing through them like a spark catching dry grass. They hadn't known. Some stared at the cowboy with surprise, others with doubt. But the weight of his words pressed into them. The woman urged her horse a step forward. "What he says is true. You speak of land as though it were only yours, but every hill, every stream, every tree remembers us. We do not ask for pity. We ask for truth, and for a place where our children can live without chains of silence." The sheriff finally spoke, his voice rough. "And if we give you this voice, what then? Will you ride away, or will you stay?" She looked at him with calm certainty. "We will stay, because this is our home too." The answer hit the crowd hard. The idea of living side by side with those they had long been taught to fear felt impossible to many. Yet the cowboy could see in their faces the beginnings of thought, of questions breaking through walls built by years of habit. The rancher's hand twitched near his rifle, but the sheriff caught his arm and pushed it down firmly. "Enough," the sheriff said, his tone carrying command. "We won't fire the first shot. Not today." A hush fell again, but this time it was different. The rage in the air thinned, replaced by something less certain, something fragile. The cowboy looked back at the woman. Her eyes softened just a fraction, and he felt a weight lift from his chest. The riders pulled their horses back, moving with discipline, not retreat, but release. The crowd began to loosen, their hands slipping away from rifles, their breath finally returning. The standoff had not ended in blood. It had ended in words, truth spoken aloud where silence had ruled for too long. Over the days that followed, the town wrestled with the choice before them. Some wanted to forget the encounter, to close their doors tighter and hope the riders vanished into the hills. Others couldn't shake the image of her standing tall. Claiming a place in a world that had tried to erase her, the cowboy became the bridge. Pulled into meetings in the saloon, into talks by the fires outside town, he listened to her stories of hunger, of families torn apart, of years spent hiding in the shadows of mountains. He carried those stories back to the townsfolk, forcing them to face truths they had long ignored. It wasn't easy. Every conversation was a battle, every agreement fragile. But slowly, the walls between them began to crack. One evening, children from the town wandered close to the Apache camp, curiosity overcoming fear. They watched wide-eyed as the riders sang by the fire, their voices low and strong. When the children returned, they told their parents not of enemies, but of songs that sounded like the wind across the plains. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The rancher who had shouted the loudest never softened. His anger stayed sharp, his words bitter. But others began to change. The blacksmith offered to trade iron tools for hides and beadwork. The shopkeeper started leaving baskets of grain near the edge of the camp. Small gestures, but they grew. The woman remained a steady figure through it all. She did not bend, but neither did she strike. She carried herself with the same strength she had brought when she first rode into the street, a reminder that her people were still here. Still standing, the cowboy watched it unfold with quiet pride, though he knew it was far from over. Suspicions still lingered, old wounds still bled beneath the surface. But the fear that had once defined every glance across the fence was fading. In its place was something new, fragile as glass, but alive. One night, as the stars stretched wide above them, the woman stood with the cowboy by the edge of the river where they had first met all those years ago. The water moved slow and steady, carrying with it the reflection of the moon. "You saved me here," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes on the water. "I didn't know what it would mean." Her gaze turned to him, sharp but warm. "It meant everything. Not just for me, but for all who stand with me now. You gave me life, and I carried it back to them. That is why we came. Not for war, for remembrance." The cowboy swallowed hard, his throat thick. "And now?" "Now," she said, "we carry the truth together. What comes next, we will decide not as enemies, but as people who share this land." The words settled between them like a promise. For the first time in many days, the cowboy felt a deep calm wash over him. The land around them seemed to sigh in relief, as though it too had been waiting for this moment. When the riders finally left weeks later, they did not vanish into the hills as ghosts. They left behind a mark, not carved into wood or stone, but carried in the minds of those who had seen them, who had heard their truth. And though not every heart was changed, enough had been that the town would never forget. The cowboy stayed by his fence as the dust of their departure rose into the horizon. He knew there would be more challenges, more fights to come. But he also knew that something had shifted forever. He had helped a forgotten girl once, and she had returned with an army of memory and strength. Together, they had stood on the edge of war and chosen another path. The land was still scarred, but it was alive. And as the wind carried the last trace of hoofbeats into the hills, the cowboy tipped his hat to the horizon, the memory of her voice lingering like the echo of a song that refused to fade. For years after, when people spoke of that day, they didn't tell it as a story of battle. They told it as the day when silence broke, when truth was spoken, and when a forgotten people stood tall once more. And in that telling, both the town and the warriors found something worth holding on to, a reminder that history is not finished, and that sometimes one act of mercy can change the course of generations. The cowboy carried that memory until his last days. The face of the girl he once saved forever, tied to the woman who returned with strength enough to make the world listen. It was a story he never claimed as his own, but one he knew he had been part of. And as time passed, the river kept flowing, the land kept breathing, the truth lived on.